Scripture reading this morning will be from the book of Ruth, chapter 2, and we'll be reading verse 11. Ruth, chapter 2, verse 11. The Bible reads, Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you forsook your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know."
Out of all the studies that we've gone through so far, I believe that Ruth has been one of my favorites. And I know I say that, and everybody's probably going to be like, we said that about all of them. I really mean it this time. It's very interesting because if you just read it without any religious association, it can be seen as a beautiful love story. But if you read it within the context of which it was written, which is really all about God and Him providing the seed line that would bring about Jesus the Christ, not only is it a love story between Ruth and Boaz, but it's a love story between God and His people. And it's actually a type of Jesus Christ and His church. And if you read throughout the entire book of Ruth, you will see so much of Christ in Boaz and so much of the church in Ruth and what the church should be, at least. And it's been quite a while since we've approached the book of Ruth, it seems like. Ruth chapter 1, and the entire chapter we looked at last month. And in Ruth chapter 1, we looked at God's provision and care. And in this chapter, what we noticed, I've actually got a different outline for chapter 1 than what I used in my sermon last month. So if you want, you can make note of this and tweak it in your own notes. But if you look throughout chapter 1, you see the idea of God's provision. And in verses 1 to 5 of chapter 1, you see impatient towards God's provision. You see that a certain man from Bethlehem, whose name was Elimelech, he and his wife Naomi, they went off into the land of Moab to find provision, to find sustenance for their family, because there was a great famine in the land. And so you see this idea of impatient towards God's provision. In verses 6 to 13, we looked at blaming God for taking away provision. And here we see that after Elimelech dies and after his two sons die, Naomi makes a statement that God has done this to me. And she'd actually make that statement 2 or 3 different times in one chapter. But even amongst this grief and sorrow, amongst a godly family, even though they sought out their own provision, it wasn't necessarily the case that they left God, but more so that they had faith in their own provision. Because throughout the chapter 1, you see this idea of, even though I'm providing for my own family, and that's really what Elimelech was trying to do. There's nothing wrong in trying to provide for your own family, but he left God's people in the sense that literally, physically, he removed himself from God's people to go to Moab, but he was still considered a godly man. His family was still considered a godly family, because Ruth would then say, "Your God shall be my God." How did she know about Jehovah if they had completely left God? Well, it's not the case that they completely left God. And with that being said, in 14 to 18, you see that Ruth specifically trusted in God's provision. "Your God shall be my God. Wherever you go, I shall go. Where you die, I shall die. And I will worship your God." And at the very end, it kind of ends on a very sour note. Verses 19 to 22, bitter towards God, emptied of provision. And this word bitter, Naomi actually uses to describe herself. She says, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me this." And it means bitter. I am a bitter woman because God has taken all of these things from me. And it's interesting how she gives herself the name, and she makes known that God is the one that has taken away all of the provision. But throughout the rest of the book, God refers to her as Naomi. He doesn't refer to her as the name that she gives herself. And throughout the entire book, we only see God providing more and more. And I really wanted to preach the two chapters together because chapter 1 ends in such a, it seems like it's just completely hopeless. And it's not until you get into chapter 2, talking about the same context as what was just previously discussed in chapter 1, that you begin to see a light of hope, a very small glimmer of hope in the lives of Naomi and Ruth. And in chapter 2, now we looked at chapter 1 talking about God's provision and care, but in chapter 2, what we see about God is God's providence and compassion. God's providence and compassion in Ruth chapter 2. And within this providence and compassion of God, you see a few things concerning the Redeemer. In verses 1 through 7, you see a plea for a Redeemer. Ruth discusses with Naomi, please allow me to go into the fields that I might find favor in someone's sight. She is looking for a Redeemer. She's looking for favor. In verses 8 through 16, you see the provision of the Redeemer. Not only does Ruth try to seek out a Redeemer, she actually ends up finding one, and his name, spoiler alert, is Boaz. And in Boaz, you see provision given from him, provision of the Redeemer. And verses 17 to 23, we see the prosperity from the Redeemer. In providing all of these provisions and food for Ruth and Naomi prosper, so much so that it's actually an overflowing of provision. 17 to 23, the prosperity from the Redeemer. Now, let's look at verses 1 through 7. And when we look at these verses, what I want to do is we first need to define two different words. Because when we read through this chapter, and really through the remainder of the book as we study this wonderful book, we need to have a comprehension of these two words, providence or provision, and redemption. If we don't understand what these two words mean, we're going to miss the whole point of the book of Ruth. Now, the word providence, it comes from, or the English word, it comes from the Latin word, which means to foresee or to attend to, ultimately evolving into our English word, which means to provide. That's where we get our English word provide, provision. It actually comes from this word that means providence, foresight of knowing what is going to happen and then taking care of something because you know what's going to happen. And then the word redemption, it simply means to buy back or to ransom. In the book of Ruth, we see both of these words being put into action constantly in each chapter. In the book of Ruth, we see how God provides a kinsman redeemer, one who would buy back Ruth, preserving the line leading to Jesus, all of which God foresaw and attended to. Now, with this being said, let's look at verses 1 through 7. The plea for a redeemer. Notice what it says in Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. It says, now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servants who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Now, when you look at verses 1 through 7, a plea for a redeemer, look at the way the entire chapter is introduced. Verses 1 to 3, we see wanting redemption. Ruth desires redemption. She wants to find favor in somebody's sight. She wants to find favor in somebody's sight so that they may take pity or give her grace and show kindness to her so that she might find food for her and Naomi. In verse 1, we see the family member, a member of the family of Elimelech. He was, number one, a very wealthy man. That's how he's introduced. A kinsman of her husband, very great in wealth. He owned his own fields. He owned his own servants. And when we read about riches in Scripture, sometimes we have a habit of automatically going to the conclusion or coming to the conclusion that riches automatically equal wickedness. That's not the case. If you read in the New Testament, it's the love of money which is the root of all evil, not money itself. And you actually see a great multitude of people who are quite wealthy, Old and New Testament, that were very faithful to God. One of the very first ones being Abraham. He was a businessman. He had a lot of flocks. He had a lot of servants. He was a general of his own military, read of in the book of Genesis. And yet he was one that found favor in the eyes of God. You see in the New Testament people such as Lydia, who was of great wealth, but yet look at her. She provided great things for the people of God. Here it's no different from Boaz. Even though he is a great and wealthy man, notice what is said about Boaz. I don't want to get ahead of my notes here, but if you look at the very first, we're introduced to Boaz in verses 1 and 2, but we're not actually introduced to Boaz being in the scene until around verses 4 and 5 when he actually comes in person. And some of the very first things we see about Boaz is that he has a godly greeting. The very first thing that comes out of Boaz's mouth is, "May the Lord be with you. May the Lord bless you." And, you know, the book of Ruth is not the only place we read about Boaz. In fact, if just very quickly, turn with me to the very end of the book of Ruth. At the end of the book of Ruth, specifically in verse 18 and following, look at what is said to conclude the book. It says, "Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David." So you see a direct descendant from Boaz to David, which would be one of the greatest kings in the land of Judah. But, you know, again, we're still in the book of Ruth. If you turn over to Matthew chapter 1, we see that in the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, Boaz is mentioned. I believe in some English translations, his name is spelled B-O-O-Z, Boaz. But it's still the same individual, because if you look at his father, Solomon, it's the exact same line. Now, why am I bringing this genealogy up? Well, as I was reading through this book, it struck me, why on earth would Boaz, why would anybody for that matter, take pity on a Moabite woman? A foreigner, a woman in this context and in this culture, unfortunately, women were looked down upon, and at some points in certain cultures were just seen as property. They almost weren't even seen as human beings, which was terrible. But in this culture, in this time, the women were seen as lower class. So not only is she a Gentile, she is a specific Gentile from the land of Moab, which was seen as a very disgusting tribe, and she was a woman who had no husband. She was a widow, and so there was nobody to take care of her. So who was going to take favor on her? Where was she going to find favor in whoever's sight that may take pity upon her? Well, if you read throughout the book of Ruth, Boaz was not the closest kinsman to redeem her, to be the kinsman redeemer. He had to go to an individual and say, "Would you like to redeem this family?" And the individual said, "I'm going to pass on this one." Why would anybody take any pity on a Gentile woman who comes from a background of complete, a background of scandalous and disgusting heritage? What I find fascinating about this is the importance of genealogy. Who was Boaz's father? Salmon. Well, why is that important, preacher? Well, if you look in Matthew chapter 1, who is the wife of Salmon? You see Rahab. Rahab, who was a Gentile harlot. You know, if you read in the very beginning of this book, the book of Ruth, you have to notice the time as well. Now, it came about in the days of the judges, when the judges governed. This was during a time when everyone did that which was right in his own sight, and there was no king in Israel. There was no order. It was complete and utter chaos during the time of the judges. So to find somebody like Boaz, who was godly, was very, very rare. But not only was it rare to find somebody who acknowledged God's law, you found it almost impossible to find somebody who was like Jesus the Christ, who what Jesus the Christ would be. Somebody who not only was godly, who came from the line of Judah, but took pity and favor on Gentiles. Not just Gentiles, but a Gentile woman. If you look at Boaz's upbringing, Boaz knew what it meant to provide for a foreign woman who was looked down upon by the Israelites, because his mother was the exact same thing. And so seeing the example of Salmon, his father, he sees this Moabite woman, a Gentile woman whose heritage it would be frowned upon, and says, who is this woman? And if you look, he looks past the heritage and looks at her character and her personality and her heart and her work ethic. In fact, if you keep reading in verse 2 and following, as she is searching for favor, what is it that Boaz says? We haven't actually gotten to it in verses 11 and 12. He says, everything that is said about you has come to my attention. You know, you have a good reputation, Ruth, and it's not gonna go unseen. Boaz made sure to give credit where credit was due, even if it wasn't considered if they weren't considered a Jew. Now look at verse 2, searching for favor. Ruth desired to find favor in somebody's sight. This word favor literally means grace. Usually it's used in reference in finding approval in the eyes of an owner or a master. For example, Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8. But Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of God. And it said like some 10 to 15 different times throughout the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 19 and verse 19. Chapter 30 and verse 27. Chapter 32 and verse 5. And it keeps on going, this idea of finding favor. And every time you see this idea of finding favor in somebody's sight, typically it's somebody of lower class finding favor in the eyes of either their master or somebody above them in some way, shape, or form, whether it's their physical master or God himself. She was looking for approval. She was looking for grace. She was looking for riches that she really didn't deserve. She is a Gentile. She doesn't belong here. Why would anybody take pity upon her? Well, guess who took pity on her? Boaz. Look at verse 3. Gleaning in the fields. She was proving herself. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. She worked hard in the fields with the official workers, and it would be noticed, we would see later on in this chapter, she was seeking favor in someone's eyes that would take pity on her, so she had to work hard. She had to prove herself. But not only do we see this idea of proving herself, we see providence or happenstance. Notice what it says. As she was working or gleaning in the field, she happened to come upon the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. You know, I am not God, obviously. I don't have infinite knowledge or infinite wisdom. And therefore, I can't put my finger on something and explicitly say, this was providence. This exactly is what God had in store or planned out for you. I don't have the authority to say that. However, we do see examples in Scripture in the book of Genesis, for example, Joseph and his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. you can look back on your life and say, you know what, it's very interesting how this happened. Here's an example. I know of an older couple a long, long time ago. And they had just had their first kid. It was their daughter. And I think they were on their way to having their second child, or perhaps their second child was just an infant. It was a son, a daughter and a son. And the couple never grew up in the church. In fact, the wife, she grew up, I believe, Pentecostal, and then the husband, he really didn't grow up in the church. He had association with the Church of Christ, but he was never faithful. He wasn't baptized until 21 or 25 years old. And as they had their children and they started their family, they attended services, but they were very, very weak in their attendance, and slowly they just faded out. They just stopped showing up. And there were a lot of people asking about them, but they said, well, they'll probably come back. It's not, they'll come back. We know them. Well, there was only one couple that went to their house and said, hey, we miss y'all. And they didn't rebuke them. They didn't get on to them. They just said, hey, we just wanted to stop by and say that we missed y'all at services. And the couple with the children, they invited them to come in. They sat down. They had something to eat. And after the conversation, it was a very short conversation, the husband of the household said, we'll be there Sunday. And that man and his wife would grow up, and their family would grow up, and that man would become a deacon in the Lord's church, and then ultimately an elder of the Lord's church, and his son would grow up to be a preacher, and then that preacher would get married, and then they would have 7 kids, and one of those kids would be here at Maybank Church of Christ. If it wasn't for that couple that went over and just happened to come by their house, a lot of my family probably wouldn't be in the church. It's very interesting how she just happened to come across this field that belonged to a family member of Naomi, and he just happened to be the only one that would take pity on this Gentile woman. I believe that God had a plan in all of this. And we may think, well, I have no idea what the future holds. Well, it doesn't matter because you're not God. The only one that it does matter to know what the future holds is God, because he knows all things. And guess what? He is in control. And it does not matter what your actions are. He can work through you. Now, I'm not saying that he will possess you and force you to do anything. That's not how God works. In fact, if you go back to our example in the book of Genesis, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. It's very interesting how even in our Bible class this morning, you see men like Antiochus Epiphanes who tried to annihilate the Jewish people, but yet through his efforts to try and annihilate, I'll get it out here in a minute, annihilate the people of God, guess what happened? They became stronger. They became more faithful. And through that line, Jesus the Christ would come. It does not matter what people try to do or whether they realize they're doing anything or not. God still works through people today. And we need to realize that God works through a providential way. And remember where that word providence came from, what it means? It means to know what is going to happen and then provide for. God sees what's going to happen before it even happens and then makes provision for it to happen. Notice this in verses 4 through 7. She worked hard. She happened to come across a field that coincidentally happened to be in the ownership of Boaz, a family member of Naomi. And look what is said in verses 4 through 7. Her work was recognized. Look what it says in verse 4. We see, number 1, verse 4, a godly greeting. And then verse 5, we see a curious question from Boaz. Who on earth is this woman? And then verses 6 through 7, we see that question is answered. She is a working woman. She is a working woman. Look at verse 4 with me. A godly greeting. We were already introduced to Boaz in verses 1 to 2 at the beginning of the book. However, this is the first time we actually see him come onto the scene. And notice the very first thing we see Boaz doing. May the Lord be with you. The very first picture and scene we see of Boaz is him encouraging his servants, giving him a greeting of godly fellowship. May the Lord be with you. You you have to remember again the time of which all of this took place. Judges, it's in the time of the judges. Do you realize just how amazing this is to find a man in a period of darkness and chaos, in a time of wickedness? You see a man who the very first thing we see is come out of his mouth is, "May the Lord be with you." It is very discouraging to live in this world. It always has been, it is, and it will continue to be this way because the world is full of darkness and sin. However, even though this world may be full of darkness and chaotic, there are still people in this world like Boaz. And the question can really be, are you Boaz? Are you the individual in a time of darkness and chaos, in a time such as the Judges, where the very first thing that comes out of your mouth when you see somebody is the Lord? Are you encouraging? Are you uplifting the people that work for you, your family members, your loved ones, your friends, complete strangers? Are you being like Boaz and having a godly greeting with everybody you come in contact with? Now notice this. After he gives this godly greeting in verse 4, look at verse 5. It says, "Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?'" Ruth stood out. And a lot of people say, well, she stood out because she was a Gentile woman. Of course she was going to stand out. Well, if you keep reading, what is she doing in this chapter? She is gleaning in the fields with the reapers. This was not uncommon for foreigners and strangers to glean the fields. In fact, if you look in Leviticus chapter 19 and verses 9 and 10, this was a law given by God. It says, "Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord God." God put in his law, when you harvest the fruits of your labor, you make sure to leave some and provide for the stranger and for those who are in need. So it was very common for strangers, people that you didn't know, to be seen in your fields picking up what was left over. What made Ruth stand out? Well, if you look in verses 6 through 7, you see exactly why she stood out. Perhaps she stood out because of her work. Maybe she stood out because of her temperament and personality. Perhaps she stood out because of the kindness and respectfulness that was within Ruth. But you see, it explicitly says in verses 6 through 7, answering Boaz, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, 'Please let me go glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now, and she has been sitting in the house for a little while." You see a few things here said about Ruth that stand out even to the workers, not just Boaz. The workers recognized it. What's the very first thing said about Ruth in the report of the man who's over the reapers? Well, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. You know, it is important to have association with godly people. It's more important to be a part of the godly people, but Ruth is associated with Naomi. Naomi had a good reputation within the community. And it's not just she was known for being associated with Naomi. Boaz makes mention in verses 11 and 12, it is known that you take care of Naomi. Not you're associated with Naomi, you take care of Naomi. What made Ruth stand out? She was a caretaker. She put others before herself. What else is said about Ruth? Well, it's look at her request. "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." She requested work. She didn't sit back and say, well, somebody's going to do it for me. She got to work. She had a great work ethic. Not only did she provide, and not only was she a good caretaker for those who didn't have anybody to care for them, she went out, found work, and said, "Please, let me work. I need to provide. Let me get something out of this so I can go back and provide for Naomi." And notice this, Thus she has come and has remained from morning until now. She was working when the sun rose, and she was working up to that point. She hadn't stopped working. Now notice this. When she did stop working, she has been sitting in the house for a little while. She was a patient woman. She was a caretaker. She was a provider. She was a hard worker, and she was a patient individual. How did Ruth stand out from all of the other individuals, all of the other strangers, all of those who were in need that also gleaned the field? Look at Ruth's character. It stood out. Now, this is where I really want to focus in on the remainder of this sermon, is verses 8 to 16. And remember what we said in the beginning of this lesson. Boaz and Ruth are a type or a foreshadowing of Jesus the Christ and the church. And if you have noticed everything said about Ruth, apply that to the church. Is that not what the church is supposed to be? Is the church not supposed to care for those who have nobody else to care for? James chapter 1 and verses 24 through the end of the chapter. What is it that James says? Pure and undefiled religion is this, that one see to the need and take care of the orphans and the widows and remain unspotted from the world. The church is supposed to be a caretaker. But not only are those supposed to be caretakers, they are supposed to be hard workers in the vineyard or the fields of the Redeemer. What is Boaz at the end of this book? He's the kinsman redeemer. What is the church supposed to be? The church is supposed to be working in the field of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus the Christ. And we are supposed to have a good work ethic. We're supposed to be working to the point where our work will be seen by men, but that's not the point of it. In our work being seen by men, what is the work supposed to be doing? Glorifying our Father who is in heaven. What is Ruth doing? Through her actions, she'll actually be glorifying here in just a second. But not only that, she has been sitting in the house for a little while. She is patiently waiting for the kinsman redeemer. What are we supposed to be doing as the church? As we labor in the field, working for our kinsman redeemer, we are to be patient in waiting for our kinsman redeemer to approach us on the day of judgment, to see the final harvest and to take up all of his servants. Now, with this being said, we looked at the type of the church, Ruth. Let's look at the type of Jesus the Christ, which is Boaz. In verses 8 through 16, you see provision of the Redeemer. Now, make note, Boaz demonstrates two different categories of provision here in verses 8 through 16. He demonstrates two categories. Now, this is going to get kind of confusing, so bear with me. There's two categories, and each one has 5 different gifts of provision. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. Boaz demonstrates two categories, and in each category, there are 5 different gifts that he gives to Ruth. Ultimately to Naomi at the end of the book, or the end of the chapter. But here, there are 10 total gifts that he provides for Ruth. Notice what is said in verses 8 through 16. Now, this is after he gets the information about Ruth. This is after he gets all of the facts, and now he goes to Ruth. Notice this. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have you found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work. Your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, For you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. Now we're going to put a pin here in verse 13. In verses 8 to 13, the passage that we just read, we see category number 1, familial provision. Boaz provides familial provision, a provision of family. Notice this, verses 8 through 9, he provides safety. He provides safety for Ruth. Glean only in my fields. Verse 9, he provides fellowship. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink. You know, this idea of going to the water jars and drink, that was for the workers. That was only for his people. But by saying you have access to the provision of water and food, he'll actually provide a feast later in the next category. But with this water, he's saying, you are in fellowship with my servants. You follow after the maidservants. I have told my servants not to touch you. That is to escort you out of my field, not to harm you in any way. You have full access and you have fellowship with my servants. He provides first safety. He then provides fellowship. Notice this in verses 10 through 12. He provides recognition. What you have done has been reported. He says, look, I recognize your hard work, not just in the fields, but your work for Naomi. You yourself are going through a grieving process, and you're providing help for those who are also grieving. I recognize this, Boaz says. He also says, number 4, that I'm going to provide favor. I'm going to provide favor for you. Notice this. I have found favor in your sight, Ruth says. Boaz makes it clear from the previous 3 gifts that he has obviously given favor as a gift. I am giving you favor. I'm giving you grace. I'm giving you approval. And then number 5, notice what he gives. He gives comfort. For you have comforted me and indeed spoken kindly. Boaz provides familial provision for Ruth. What is it that Jesus provides for those who seek refuge in him? Under the wing of the Lord, which Boaz makes reference to in verses 11 and 12. Well, Jesus provides safety. You stay in my fields. You glean in my fields. You work in my fields. He provides fellowship. You eat and drink with my servants. If you want to be a part of my people, you can have fellowship with my people. He provides recognition. I have seen everything that you've done. In fact, is that not what he's going to say on the day of judgment? Well done, thou good and faithful servant. He sees everything. You read about this in Revelation chapter 2, that he walks among the churches. He sees everything of what's going on, and he sees the work and the struggles and the grieving and everything that we go through here on earth. Jesus sees it, and he gives recognition. He also gives favor. You find favor we find favor in the sight of Jesus the Christ. That is, if we act like Ruth. What is favor again? It's grace. It's approval. It's God's riches at Christ's expense. We find grace in the eyes of God because Christ offers it to us as a free gift, the book of Romans tells us. And also in Jesus Christ, with this familial provision in the church, we find comfort. You know, I was just talking to somebody before services about this idea of comfort. And in this conversation, we were talking about how it is amazing how Christians can go through all types of hardships. They can go through loss. They can go through financial struggle. They can go through sickness. They can go through any type of difficulty and trial that comes their way, and yet they can come out on top with a smile and at peace. How are they able to do that? Because they find comfort in Jesus the Christ. They have hope. They have found favor. But those who are outside the family, the familial provision that we read of in Ephesians chapter 1, that is that we are adopted into the family of God, if we choose him, that is, being a part of the elect, the Christians. Those who are outside of that group, they can go through the exact same thing. And yet, look at the difference. You have one person who is a part of the familial provision of God, and they come out with a smile saying, "Blessed be God, even though I have lost so and so. Blessed be the Lord, for even though I am bankrupt and I have people stealing money from me, blessed be God, even though I'm going through this trial." But yet you have people who are trying to just get by, and they're facing the exact same trials, and yet they've got zero hope. It's almost like they're wandering around completely blind in darkness. If we look at Jesus the Christ as our kinsman redeemer, as Boaz was to Ruth, we can find all of these familial provisions and have hope. But you know what? We've only covered one category. What's the other category? Verses 14 through 16. Notice what it says. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you shall purposefully pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." What category is this? Well, this is occupational provision. You have the provision of family, now you've got the provision of occupation. Notice the five different gifts that Boaz gives to Ruth. Number one, in verse 14, you have a feast, a gift of a feast. "Come here that you may eat of the bread." Also in verse 14, you see the second gift, position. He says, "Sit here so that you may eat with the reapers. Eat at my table." Don't sit off to the side like some stranger. You're a part of the family now, Ruth. Come sit with me at my table with my servants so that we might have fellowship. She has gained position in the eyes of Boaz. We also see in verse 15 the third gift. The third gift is acceptance. Let her glean even among the sheaves. Don't let her just get the leftover. Don't let her just go around the corners and the outside of the field. You let her come into the field and let her get some of the best of the crop so that she can get some of the best of the crop that falls on the ground. But not only does she receive acceptance of coming into the field, not just on the outside edges, she receives abundance of blessings, the gift of abundance. Notice what Boaz says, "You shall purposefully pull out for her some grain." He doesn't just give her the leftovers. He says, you pull out some of the best and you leave it for her. And notice the last gift, authorization. "And do not rebuke her." He says it like twice. You do not make fun of her and you do not rebuke her. You accept her. Is this not exactly what Jesus the Christ does for both Jew and Gentile? Is it not that he gives a feast to those who are his servants? What is the feast that we will partake of after the laboring is done? Well, we will receive the great feast in heaven. What about position? Well, you read throughout the entire New Testament, all the way into the book of Revelation, if you overcome, you shall receive this. You shall receive a crown. You shall receive a robe. You shall receive a place in my Father's house. If we are like Ruth and we are obedient and submissive and we show respect and we are caretakers and we have a good work ethic, we will receive position in the kingdom of God. We also will receive acceptance. We will be accepted by Jesus Christ, but not just accepted, we will be accepted with great abundance. God is not going to give us the leftovers. He is going to give us some of the best of the crop at the end of this life. And notice, we will have authorization to enter into his kingdom, just like Ruth had authorization to enter into the field and household of Boaz. Now, with all of this being said, let's conclude our lesson. We have our last point, but this is more of a concluding point. Look at verses 17 to 23. Prosperity from the Redeemer. Notice what it says in verses 17 to 23. "So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw that what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied from the feast. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." Then Ruth, the Moabitess, said, "Furthermore, he said to me, 'You should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, so that others do not fall upon you in another field." So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, very quickly, you have a short outline. Verse 17, you've got the spoils. Ruth has been spoiled by Boaz. Not only has he allowed her to glean in his fields, he allowed her to come into the field and not just glean, but pick up some of the best of the harvest, as well as give her some leftovers from the feast, leaving her full from the feast, having some left over, saying, what am I going to do with all this food, Boaz? You take it home and you take care of yourself and Naomi. At the end of the day, Ruth had harvested and threshed nearly 6 gallons, about 34 liters of barley grain. And one commentator said, if you do the math of portioning out how they portioned it, what she gained that day for her and Naomi would have lasted them about a year. Boaz provided almost a year's worth of supply of food for Ruth and Naomi, plus a lunchbox. He says, you think that's enough? Here's a little bit more. In verse 18, we see the satisfaction. There was so much left over that even after Ruth had her fill and satisfaction of the feast that she was a part of and had all of this food and grain from the harvest, that Naomi was taken aback of just how much Ruth had gleaned. Can you imagine? Naomi, she's wondering, I wonder if Ruth's going to get enough for her. I wonder if somebody's going to take pity on her. I really hope that somebody just shows some favor to Ruth. And then Ruth comes back with a year's worth of supply of food and leftovers from a great feast that she was a part of. Can you imagine the joy that was in Naomi's eyes? Where did you work today? Where did you get all of this food? And notice this in verses 19 to 20, you see the surprise. And after Naomi is surprised with all of this food and wealth, look at 21 to 23. Ruth gives an answer. I'll tell you where I worked. There was a man named Boaz, and he allowed me to work in his fields. Notice this, verse 21. She says, Boaz, he gave the invitation of grace. He gave an invitation of favor. He said to me, I should stay in his field. Notice what Naomi says. You should stay close to that. You should stay close to the servants. Because what was it that Boaz says? I don't want you going to any other field. You stay close to my servants and you will receive favor. In verse 22, why should Ruth stay close to Boaz? Why would Naomi encourage Ruth to stay close to Boaz? Well, verse 22, we see the benefits of grace, the benefits of favor. It is good, my daughter, that you go with his maids so that others do not fall upon you in another field. Why should Ruth stay close to Boaz and his servants? Because Boaz provides safety. Boaz provides protection from danger. And then you see verse 23, the acceptance of grace. It says, so she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Look at the way this chapter begins and the way that it ends. Ruth seeks grace, seeks favor, and Boaz offers safety. At the end of the book, end of the chapter, Ruth asks Naomi if she may, excuse me, I got this backwards. It starts out by Ruth seeking favor, asking, hey, can I go seek somebody for favor? And Boaz says, I'll give it to you. It ends with Naomi encouraging, you stay with Boaz. Boaz will take care of you. And Naomi encourages Ruth to heed Boaz's invitation. And notice, if you look right in the middle of the chapter, what is the very middle of the chapter? It says, Boaz replied, verse 11, to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. What is very interesting about all of this is look at how the book started out. It was death, it was sorrow and grief, it was bitterness, and notice how the book continues. That's not how it ends. That's just the beginning. How it would actually end, which we're going to get to, Lord willing, in the coming months, it ends with so much prosperity and so much provision that Ruth actually not only becomes a part of the family, she actually, through her, comes Jesus the Christ. She has overwhelming abundance of blessings. She has an overwhelming amount of provision. She has safety. She has Boaz. What does the church have? You know, it may be that you started out in your life full of death and grief and sorrow, and it seems like your life is just bitter. You have the same attitude as Naomi did. Just call me a bitter individual. I've got no hope. There's nothing for me. But then you happen to come across in the fields of Boaz. And in this field, not only do you find favor in the kinsman redeemer, the kinsman redeemer goes out of his way to take care of you. He recognizes your grief. He recognizes the death in your life, and he says, why don't you stay in my fields and stay with my servants, and I will protect you. I will provide you a great feast. I will provide you position. I will provide you all of these things if you just stay with me. So the question stands, are you staying with your kinsman redeemer? Have you happened to come across, through the providence of God, the servants of the kinsman redeemer? And through the servants, you have found the kinsman redeemer. And in finding the kinsman redeemer, you have to make a decision. Am I going to stay in his field with his servants where I can be protected? Or am I going to try and find refuge in somebody else's field? Well, let me warn you, if you seek somebody else's field, guess what's going to happen to you? People are going to fall upon you. People will insult you. People will rebuke you. And people will mistreat you. But the kinsman redeemer will make sure that none of that will happen in his field. Yes, we may struggle in this life, but if we keep laboring in his field, he will provide a safety and provision that is unlike anything, that will not just last for a year, it will last for an eternity. And when we see the provision in its full glory, we'll be way more surprised than Naomi. Look how great this is. You know, you can have that peace of mind even in times of darkness, in the times of the judges where there is no king in Israel, and every man did that which is right in his own eyes. You can find peace in a time of darkness and chaos if you come to the kinsman redeemer now, as together we stand and as we sing. There's nothing to pray, nothing to pray.